Good afternoon. I am David Kerp, an associate professor in the Department of History at Ohio University and also a fellow of our Contemporary History Institute. And I've been invited by the head of our Contemporary History Institute, Dr. Ingo Trauschweitzer, to give a short presentation on Poland's place and perspectives on the current Russo-Ukrainian crisis. As a historian of Polish history and of Polish society, it is difficult not to be aware of the significance of conflict, the centrality of conflict in Russo Polish relations. While there certainly have been periods of cooperation as well, unfortunately, those have been few and far between. It's important to note, I think, in relation to the current crisis, that many of the initial problems and conflicts, wars between Poland and Russia, occurred over strategic competition in Eastern Europe, particularly in Ukraine, where both Poland and Russia sought to gain control of Ukrainian spaces. It had appeared by the mid 20th century that Poland had decisively lost that contest after World War II. Almost all territories that Ukrainians claimed were their own fell under Soviet Russian control, and Poles who had been a long-standing presence in Ukraine for hundreds of years were ethnically cleansed from the region. However, in 1989, with the collapse of Soviet power, Russia lost a great deal of influence in Ukraine. Many Polish commentators, statesmen, even though they hoped for a correction and the um, putting of Russian Polish relations on a new and better footing than ever before, at the same time, also regarded Ukrainian independence as a key element of Polish racja stanu, reason of state, and something that would also be good for the independence of all the countries of Eastern Europe, including Russia, which needed to divest itself of imperial ambitions to become a free country. In spite of Polish and Russian initial efforts in the early 1990s to establish better relations, by the mid to late 1990s, many Polish observers came to believe that Russia was engaged in a policy of imperial reconquest, restoration of influence in former Russian imperial and Soviet spaces. And they saw that stepped up in the course of the last several decades under Vladimir Putin's rule. Russian efforts to dominate Central and Eastern Europe have also included direct military threats to Poland, particularly in relation to eventual Polish willingness, after initial reluctance, to host a U.S. missile defense system in Europe that was primarily going to be aimed at protecting European countries from potential Iranian attacks, but which Russia regarded as so unacceptable that when Poles offered to cooperate, eventually, after some initial hesitation, with the American effort to install missile defenses in Europe, the Russian response included direct military threats against Poland as well as the Czech Republic. So Poland's history, both recent and in the distant past, has been quite conflicted with Russia and has led Poles to regard Russia as taking Russia at its word, particularly under Putin, that Russia regards the West as a major strategic competitor and as the vanguard of the corruption of values and the integrity of the Russian state and Russian allies abroad in what Putin and his collaborators have called the Ruski Mir, the Russian world. I would now draw attention to Poland's relations with Ukraine, and Poland has also gone from a country that had initially quite bad relations with Ukraine, particularly the people to people relations between Poles and Ukrainians. In the modern period, Ukrainian nationalism often developed in competition with what many Ukrainians quite rightly perceived as Polish efforts to continue to influence, even dominate Ukrainian culture, society, and politics. These bad people to people social relations manifested themselves at their worst during the Second World War, when the Ukrainian nationalist in the Ukrainian insurgent army, the UPA, launched campaigns to force those Poles living in territories Ukrainian nationalists regarded as Ukrainian out of their country. These were campaigns of ethnic cleansing that often involved a great deal of mass murder, were conducted in alliance with Nazi Germany. The Ukrainian insurgent army, the UPA, was not simply a Nazi tool. It had its own agenda, its own goals, but it worked in collaboration with the Nazis to conduct campaigns of ethnic cleansing. Anywhere from 50 to 100,000 Poles died during this conflict. Hundreds of thousands of more Poles needed to flee what used to be Polish regions of Ukraine, and they brought with them horrible memories. Now, Poles themselves committed atrocities in efforts at self defense and in their treatment of local Ukrainian population. So no one had clean hands, but this further poisoned Polish perceptions of Ukraine. In spite of the strategic analysis of Polish elites that Ukrainian independence remained a key Polish agenda item, people to people relations didn't start improving until the early 21st century, and particularly after 2014, when many Ukrainians fled their homeland that was caught up in economic stagnation and eventually war with Russia after the Russian incursion into Crimea and the Russian support of armed separatists in eastern Ukraine. And there has been a substantial improvement in social relations between Poles and Ukrainians. And the Polish government, which has a rather bad reputation for its treatment of immigrants from the Middle East, has embraced the Ukrainian diaspora, has granted several 100,000 Ukrainians legal permits to work in Poland, has turned a blind eye towards other Ukrainians living and working in Poland. And so we've seen a healing of Polish Ukrainian relations and Polish efforts to sponsor Ukraine as a country that should be more fully integrated into the European project, the European Union, and also have a place in NATO, both again for Poland's security, the security of the region, and Poles would argue, many of them, that also for the good of Europe as a whole, even Russia. But this is part of a difference in Polish perspectives with its Western partners that has produced a great deal of tension. Germany has sought to reach out to Russia to do what many German politicians, again, across the political spectrum, many German politicians regarded as critically important to de escalate tensions with Russia. Poles have perceived these efforts at de escalation for the past couple of decades to being akin to German appeasement and acceptance of Russian great power roles regionally, in spite of professed German and European Union values that put forward the notion of sovereignty and democratization. Poles have also noticed not only the long tradition of Russo German cooperation and how that has often backfired against the integrity and freedom of the region, but also the economic ties between and the interests that tie Germany and Russia together, and how those seem to work seamlessly with German diplomacy to collaborate with Russia, with Putin's Russia. Additionally, there have been tensions with the United States. Though Americans have also given lip service to values of collaboration with smaller countries, concerns about Russian aggression, etc., Russia is something of a domestic political football in the United States, with both Democrats and Republicans alternating between regarding Russia as an enemy and trying to appease Russia, particularly under Putin. The missile defense shield is one example in which, even under the Obama, you had the Bush administration proposing missile defense to resist potential Iranian attack. The Obama administration initially saying that it would pursue missile defense, but then backing away from that and announcing the end of collaboration regionally over missile defense on September 17th, 2009, a particularly bad day, given that that was also the 70th anniversary of Nazi Soviet military collaboration in the September campaign against Poland during World War II. September 17th was the date in which Red Army troops entered Poland. So making the announcement on that day was not particularly diplomatic timing, shall we say. But it also illustrates all of the ways in which our American and Western great power insensitivity to regional concerns are not just a manifestation of arrogance, but also quite dysfunctional and have wrong footed American and Western efforts to secure peace and real sustainable collaboration regionally. Very well. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope that this has helped clarify some issues in the current crisis.